Good morning, good afternoon, but really good Chodesh or Chodesh Tov. We're starting the new month of Mar Cheshvan. It's Erev Shabbos, a good Erev Shabbos. Let's light up the darkness. So we were just listening to Hallel, which is something that we say on Rosh Chodesh when we're starting a new Hebrew month. And there's also a special addition to the Amidah, the prayer, as we say in the Talmud, the main prayer that Jewish men are obligated to say 3 times a day. And when it's Rosh Chodesh, there's a special edition. We also added this during the days of Sukkot, and we also added on the days of Pesach, Passover. But today it's Rosh Chodesh, so I just thought I would share it with you because it's a beautiful, beautiful blessing that we say at the beginning of every month. Our God and the God of our forefathers, may there rise up, arrive, and reach, be seen and be favored, be heard, be considered and be remembered, the remembrance and consideration of us, the remembrance of our forefathers, the remembrance of Mashiach ben David, Messiah, the son of David, your servant, right, God's servant, the remembrance of Jerusalem, the city of your holiness, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, and the remembrance of your entire people, the family of Israel, before you, for deliverance, for goodness, for grace, for kindness, and for compassion, for good life, and for peace on this day of Rosh Chodesh. And now we come to 3 short blessings where you say Amen. Remember us on it, Hashem, our God, for goodness. Amen. Consider us on it for blessing. Amen. And help us on it for good life. Amen. In the matter of salvation and compassion, pity, be gracious and compassionate with us and help us, for our eyes are turned to you, because you, O God, are the gracious and compassionate King. That's the beautiful addition that we make on Rosh Chodesh, on the days of Sukkot, and on the days of Pesach. Okay, who's in the house on Rosh Chodesh? Ella in Southern California, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Marjorie in Georgia, Joseph, in Nevada, and Yehudit in South Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Lorraine in Texas. I just got back from Texas this morning, had a wonderful visit in Austin, where Guns N' Moses was the opening night gala of the Austin Jewish Film Festival. Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandor in the Bronx, Renee in Indiana. Welcome, everybody. Beautiful daf today, page 127 here in Tractate Bava Basra, 23rd volume of the Talmud. Continuing our journey through chapter 8, discussing Mishnah number 5. We just started the Mishnah before I went on this little trip. So that was on Tuesday, right? And so the Mishnah says that a father can distribute his estate among his children, according to his wishes. But what he can't write expressly in his will is something that contradicts the Torah. So if he says that so-and-so, my firstborn, will not get a double portion in the inheritance, we just disregard that statement. On the other hand, if he says, as I distribute my assets, I want to make a gift to so-and-so this son and a gift to so-and-so that son, and in the end, it's like he's taking away the double portion of the firstborn, but he's doing it some kind of combination of gift and inheritance, etc., then we follow his wishes. We just don't follow if he says something expressly that contradicts the Torah, where the firstborn of a father receives the double portion. Okay, we're picking this up in the Gemara about halfway down, a little more than halfway down, about halfway down, page 126b. So Rav Yosef says that if a man says, so-and-so is my firstborn, the son takes a double portion of his inheritance based on this testimony, right? We've been talking about what the firstborn gets or doesn't get because he's the firstborn. Today we're talking about how do we know if he's the firstborn or not. It seems obvious, every family would know who's the firstborn, but it's not always so obvious. Maybe the father had multiple wives. Maybe he had a wife in one city and another wife in another city. This is when it was permitted for a man to have more than one wife. Maybe he had a son by one wife, she went away, and it's not sure which one of these sons was born first to him. Or maybe it's certain to him, but it's not certain to his neighbors, to his community. So here we're talking about whose testimony are we going to accept about whether a firstborn actually is a firstborn or not, right? So Rav Yosef says that if a man says, so-and-so is my firstborn, then the son takes the double portion, meaning we accept the father's testimony that his firstborn son is indeed his firstborn son. Now, that's just where he said, so-and-so is my firstborn. If the father says, so-and-so is a firstborn, then the son does not take a double portion, as perhaps the man was saying that the son is his mother's firstborn, but not his own firstborn, right? Like in the case of Jacob, who had 4 wives. You could say that Bilhah and Zilpah were the concubines, but he certainly had, they're treated as wives, but certainly Rachel and Leah were his wives. And Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel. Reuben was the firstborn of Leah. Reuben was also the firstborn of Jacob. Right? So if he could say about Reuben and Joseph, this is a firstborn and this is a firstborn. But he could only say of Reuben, this is my firstborn. Right? So that's that difference. Now the Gemara relates, there was a certain man who came before Rabba bar bar Chana and said to him, I know that this man is a firstborn. And Rabba bar bar Chana said to him, from where do you know? And he answered, because his father would call him a foolish firstborn. And Rabba bar bar Chana replied, well, perhaps he is his mother's firstborn, as any firstborn of a mother is also called a foolish firstborn. Now, that's not meant to be an insult against a person, let's say, in the position of Yosef, right, who was his mother's firstborn, but not his father's firstborn, since his father's firstborn was by Leah. So what does it mean that he's a foolish firstborn? It means that they're just sort of teasing and saying that because he's the mother's firstborn, he incurs certain obligations, but he doesn't. Here, let me just read the note. Although one might call his firstborn son a foolish firstborn, this is a common nickname for a person who is only his mother's firstborn, but not his father's firstborn. And the Rashbam explains that the word sichla, or shota in Hebrew, is employed in this nickname the way it is employed in the expression hadas shote, meaning wild myrtle. And the wild myrtle is related to the myrtle, but is not the same as the myrtle. And for that reason, it's not fit to be used in the four species of sukkahs. And so what they're saying is, it bears the name of myrtle, but it's actually the wild myrtle. It's not fit to be that. So, it sounds like something, but it's not. And how do we relate that here? So too, one who is his mother's firstborn, but not his father's firstborn, is an unfit firstborn. And the Maharshal explains that this nickname is meant to tease him about the fact that he has only the obligations of a firstborn, but not the rights of a firstborn, as he requires redemption, but does not receive a double portion of inheritance. Right? So his father has to pay. I mean, it's a symbolic payment, but he has to give, the coins for the Bidyon Haben to have him redeemed. You go through a little ceremony and give some money to a Kohen. So that's redemption of the firstborn. So he fulfills that mitzvah because he's his mother's firstborn. And it's nice that he's his mother's firstborn, but he doesn't receive a double portion in the inheritance of his father because he's not his father's firstborn. And so it's kind of teasingly calling him a foolish firstborn. Now the Gemara relates there was a certain man who came before Rabbi Hanina and said to him, right, about some guy, I know that this man is a firstborn. Right, so this is a situation where maybe the father went off to war, or this guy got adopted, right? No one knows whether he's a firstborn or not, but along comes somebody who knows the family or knew something about this guy when he was a child and said, I know that this man is an actual firstborn, his father's firstborn. Nobody else knows this. So Rabbi Hanina is saying, okay, well, how do you know that? How do you come to know that? From where do you know? And the man said to Rabbi Hanina, because when people would come before his father to obtain a cure for their ailing eyes, he would say to them, go to my son Sichlat, as he is a firstborn, and his saliva heals this ailment. And what is it? What are we talking about here? So there was an ailment, the medicine of the ancient world, where the saliva of a firstborn of a man, right, a father's firstborn, had some kind of a medicinal quality that none of his other sons had. And that saliva could be used to cure this particular ailment. Now the Gemara asks, but perhaps he is his mother's firstborn. And the Gemara answers, it is learned as a tradition that the saliva of a father's firstborn heals this ailment, but the saliva of a mother's firstborn does not heal that ailment. New subject. Rabbi Ami says, in the case of one whose sexual organs are indeterminate, this is known as a tumtum, and so this would be a very, very rare situation where a baby is born and there's a flap of skin covering the genitalia, and so you can't tell if he is a male or she is a female, right? So it's indeterminate because the genitalia are covered up by this flap of skin. Like I said, very, very rare. In modern times, they would just, I'm sure, do the surgery very quickly if this actually comes up. But in ancient times, they wouldn't do a surgery so quick. It would be revealed later. And they wouldn't know what the sex of the child was for some amount of time. Again, extremely rare. Despite being extremely rare, because it creates an interesting legal dilemma, an interesting legal question in halakha, in Jewish law, it comes up quite often in the Talmud, right? So they say there are 4 genders in the Talmud: male, female, tumtum, which is neither until that flap is removed or comes off naturally a little later in life, or the androgynos, which is the hermaphrodite. So this would be also extremely rare, but a baby that has both the sexual organs of a male and a female. Again, so rare, but comes up quite often in the Talmud because it presents interesting legal issues. Okay. So Rabbi Ami says regarding the tumtum, right, the indeterminate sex, and whose skin became perforated so that his genitals were revealed, and he was found to be a male. He does not take a double portion of his father's estate. Right? It is a male. The baby is male, and it's the firstborn. So why wouldn't it take the double portion? Because at the time that the baby was born, it was not revealed as a male at that time. And the law, which calls for a double portion given to the firstborn, is worded in such a way that he was known to be a male as soon as he was born. So as the Gemara explains, as the verse states, Deuteronomy 21:15, and if the firstborn son was vehaya, hers that was hated, right? That's in the passage where it says about the firstborn that even though he might have had, a wife that he married in his youth and realized he'd married the wrong person, but kept her on as a wife, then married another wife that the father was much more partial to, and both of these women, the hated wife and the beloved wife, bear him sons, and the hated wife bore him a son first. He's not going to give the right of the firstborn to the son of this wife that he loves more. Rather, his firstborn son retains that double portion, and it would be a sin to remove it from him. As the verse states, and if the firstborn son was hers that was hated, which is interpreted by the sages to mean that the tumtum is not considered a firstborn, because or a firstborn son is not considered a firstborn unless he is recognized as a son, i.e. as a male, from the moment of his coming into being, havaya, i.e. from his birth. So it's because he was not revealed as male at birth, he won't get the double portion later. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says a tumtum was found to be male. A tumtum who was found to be male is also not judged as a stubborn and rebellious son, right? The sorer umore, right? So that's the law that's in the Torah and has never been applied in the real world, right? The stubborn and rebellious son, who the sages define as like somebody who eats a whole cow and drinks an entire barrel of wine, just something that's physically impossible. But if a person did something like that, the Torah is saying that such a person is so enslaved to pursuing the pleasure of the flesh that he will eventually become a murderer, and his parents should bring him to the gate of the city, present him before the elders, and the parents should execute their son. And that law seems to be in the Torah just to teach other lessons, not because it's ever been imposed. That penalty has never been imposed in all of Jewish history, and yet it's included in the Torah. But so what they're saying here is, and perhaps this is one of the lessons that law teaches, is that for such a son to be treated that way, he would have to have been revealed as a son from birth. So a tumtum, one who's revealed to be a male later, would not qualify to be executed by his parents as the stubborn and rebellious son. Now we're on page 127a. A Maimar says, a tumtum who was found to be male also does not reduce the additional portion of the firstborn. And the Gemara, or the elucidation, explains, his portion is not taken into account in the calculation of the firstborn's additional portion. What does this mean? For example, if there are 3 brothers, a firstborn, an ordinary brother, and a tumtum. So the firstborn receives 1/3 of the property as his additional portion, as he would if he and the ordinary brother were the only heirs, meaning as if there were only 2 brothers. This is because, and the remaining 2/3 of the estate would be divided among all 3 brothers. And this is because it is stated with regard to the portion of the firstborn, and they have borne him sons, which is interpreted to mean that the brother of a firstborn does not affect his additional portion unless he is recognized as a son at the moment of his birth. Rav Shezevi says a tumtum, again, the one who has indeterminate physical sexual characteristics at birth because of this flap of skin covering the genitalia, a tumtum who was found to be male later is also not circumcised on the 8th day. So, I mean, so the actual gender of the child, physical gender of the child, was revealed within the first 8 days for this to even be relevant of his life. But what they're saying is you would make a bris, you would make a circumcision on the 8th day, but it will not override Shabbos the way that we normally do. If a child's 8th day of life, a male child's 8th day of life is Shabbos, then we will override the normal restrictions of Shabbos, for instance, shedding blood, because a little bit of blood, a drop of blood is shed when you make a circumcision. So we will override Shabbos to make a circumcision, but we won't if it's for an infant that was born as a tumtum and then revealed to be a male during that first week of life. If his 8th day occurs on Shabbos, although the mitzvah of circumcision on the 8th day generally overrides Shabbos prohibitions, we don't do that for one that was born as a tumtum. As the verse states, if a woman bears seed and gives birth to a male, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as in the days of the impurity of her sickness shall she be unclean, and on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. That's for the normal case where he's revealed as a male as soon as he's born. And this is interpreted to mean that the tumtum is not circumcised on the 8th day in the event that it occurs on Shabbos, a male is not circumcised on the 8th day, which occurs on Shabbos, unless he is recognized as a male from the moment of his birth. Rav Sherevia says his mother is also not rendered tameh, ritually impure, due to his birth. As the verse states, if a woman bears seed and gives birth to a male, then she shall be unclean 7 days. And this is interpreted to mean that she is not rendered impure unless he is recognized as a male from the moment of his birth. Now, the Gemara is going to raise an objection. Can you guess what it is, right? So basically, a woman is tameh after she gives birth. If she gives birth to a male, she's tameh 7 days. If she gives birth to a female, she's tameh 14 days. So if she gives birth to one of indeterminate gender, this tumtum, then what the uncertainty is she going to be tameh 7 days or 14 days? Which is it going to be? So the Gemara raises an objection from a Mishna tractate niddah. A woman who miscarries a tumtum, or the androgynos, the hermaphrodite, who has both sexual organs, male and female, she observes the strictures of a woman who gave birth to a male and to a female. Since it is uncertain whether the fetus is male or female, the woman must observe the laws of ritual impurity, the laws of tumah, according to both possibilities. And this appears to be a conclusive refutation of the statement of Rav Sherevia that a woman who gives birth to a tumtum is not rendered tameh at all. And the Gemara affirms this is a conclusive refutation. So if she gives birth to a tumtum, she's going to be tameh 14 days in case it's a female. Now the Gemara asks, she has to observe separation from her husband for 14 days. And then immerse in mikvah. So the Gemara asks, shall we say it is also a conclusive refutation of the statement of Rav Shezevi? And by the way, there's a greater separation than that. There's also the longer period of counting after she immerses in the mikvah, but of absolute niddah for either 7 or 14 days also has implications not only for separation from her husband, but if she comes into contact with certain foods or certain items that she could transmit the tumah to, etc. But the point is that there's a different count of days when she gives birth to a male versus a female. So the Gemara asks, shall we say it is also a conclusive refutation of the statement of Rav Shezevi with regard to circumcision, as the law of circumcision is stated together with the law of tumah? And the Gemara explains, the Tana of the Mishna in Tractate Niddah is uncertain whether the birth discussed in the verse includes that of a tumtum, and therefore he rules stringently that she should observe the laws of tumah for both possibilities, male and female. And Rav Shezevi's ruling can follow the same logic. The infant should not be circumcised on Shabbos, as it is uncertain whether the mitzvah of his circumcision overrides the prohibitions of Shabbos, since at the moment of his birth, they didn't know whether he was a male or not. Maybe the flap of skin, peeled away or was removed, and then it was revealed that he was a male. But because there was that flap of skin at the moment of birth, it's unclear whether his bris on the 8th day would override the prohibitions of Shabbos. So the Gemara asks, if so, that the Tana of the Mishna in Tractate Niddah is uncertain whether the birth discussed in the verse includes that of a tumtum, the Mishnah should have stated that the woman observes the strictures of a woman who gave birth to both a male and to a female, and also as a menstruating woman. It is uncertain whether the laws of ritual purity after birth pertain to a woman who gives birth to a tumtum at all. She should observe the law. If it is uncertain, right? If there's still this possibility that if she gave birth to a tumtum, she's not going to be tameh at all, neither the days of a male nor the days of a female, well, then maybe she should take into account simply the days that a woman who discharges blood, uterine blood, which is part of giving birth. So maybe she should just have the tumah of any woman who menstruates. If it is uncertain whether the laws of ritual purity after birth pertain to a woman who gives birth to a tumtum at all, so she should observe the laws of ritual impurity for any blood that emerges in the time period following the birth, as it should have the status, at least, of the blood of a menstruating woman. And so the Gemara concludes, yes, this poses a difficulty. Rava says that it is taught in a baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Ami, that a tumtum firstborn does not receive the double portion of the inheritance because he wasn't revealed to be a male at the time that he was born. And the baraisa states from the phrase firstborn son, right? It is derived that only a son receives a double portion, but not a tumtum. And only a definite firstborn receives a double portion, but not one about whom it is uncertain if he is the firstborn. So as a little digression about the tumtum, what we were really talking about is, what if we're not sure if the firstborn is a firstborn or not? So the Gemara asks, granted the law that a son receives a double portion, but a tumtum does not, this is understandable, as it is in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Ami. But what case does the law that only a definite firstborn receives a double portion, but not one about whom we have an uncertainty, what is that going to exclude? Why would one about whom it is uncertain if he is a firstborn receive a double portion? In other words, isn't it obvious if we're not certain that he's a firstborn, that he's not going to get a double portion? In what situation would be a possible firstborn, but not a definite firstborn, indeed receive the double portion of the firstborn? And the Gemara answers, this serves to exclude that which Rava taught. As Rava taught, that if two wives of the same husband gave birth to two males in hiding, so that it is unknown which son was born first, right? So imagine a time of persecution, an evil empire is coming to kill Jews like the Roman Empire did, or imagine in Egypt when Pharaoh decreed that all the males would be thrown in the river, and a man has two wives, and these wives went and hid, and they hid in separate caves, lest the soldiers discover one of the caves and kill. Both wives were in one cave, then the man would lose all his wives and all his children. So he separated the wives. And they were pregnant, maybe they became pregnant at approximately the same time. They went and hid in these separate caves. They gave birth to their babies. Let's say the danger ended and the women came home with the babies. And, they lost track of the calendar while they were hiding in these caves. And so they don't know which baby was born first. Right? And let's say this would be the firstborn of this man. Both had male children. They don't know which one was born first. So we don't know which of these two baby boys is the firstborn son of this father. That's the situation that they're hypothesizing. So what do we do? So that it is unknown which son was born first, and the husband subsequently had other sons. Okay, so one of these two babies that grow up is the firstborn, and then later there's other sons. Now we know that those other sons, none of them is the firstborn. But of the two who are possibly firstborn, we don't know which. So here's one solution to that dilemma. Right, says Rava that in that situation, each of the two possible firstborns writes an authorization to the other. Since the later brothers can claim against each of them individually that he is not the firstborn, since it's unclear which of them is the firstborn, right? The other brother is going to say, yeah, so there's no firstborn. We're all going to divide equally. Nobody's getting a double portion because none of them qualify. But these two that are possible firstborns, they know that one of them deserves the double portion. They're not sure which. So what they're going to say is, okay, so let's split. Let's, between us, take that extra portion of the firstborn and we'll split it. Instead of one of them getting a double portion, since they don't know which one of them is the firstborn, they say between the two of them, they'll take that extra portion and each of them will end up with 1.5 portions, right? The rest of the later brothers, they'll each get 1 portion, and these two possible firstborns will each end up with 1.5 portions of the inheritance, right? Since their brothers can claim against each of them individually that he is not the firstborn and does not deserve a double portion, each of these possible firstborns writes the other an authorization to collect his portion so that they can jointly claim the additional portion in any event, right? As a unit, the two of them can claim it. Rav Papa subsequently said to Rava, right, that was an interesting solution from Rava, but Rav Papa said to him, but didn't Ravin send a letter from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia stating, I asked all my teachers about this matter and they did not tell me anything. But this is what they did say in the name of Rabbi Yanai. If the two sons were initially recognized, i.e., it was known which one of them was the firstborn, and they were ultimately mixed, and now the firstborn cannot be identified, in that situation, each writes an authorization to the other, and they can split the portion of the firstborn. But if they were not initially recognized, each does not write an authorization to the other. In other words, if at a certain moment, at some time, it was known who was the firstborn, right? But then the babies got mixed up, and no one can say for sure which one was the firstborn, right? It was at some time known this baby is the firstborn. But, whatever, they lost track of the babies, the mothers were, God forbid, killed in some kind of persecution, and now it's not known. But at least the mother knew which one was the firstborn, then they can split the double portion between them. But in the case that we started with, where these two mothers went to separate caves and then they came back, and it was never known which is the firstborn, in that situation, you can't do this procedure that Rava suggested, writing authorizations for each other, and there's not going to be a double portion for anybody in that family. So what did Rava do? He was issuing that ruling, right? His solution to the problem. When Rav Papa told him, what the other sages were saying, that no, your solution doesn't work, Rava not only acknowledged that he was wrong, he had been overruled by a greater authority. What Rava then did is he established an Amora to repeat his lesson to the masses aloud, right? An Amora is somebody who's repeating the lessons of the sages. So this Amora went to the masses out loud. In other words, somebody with a loud voice who understands the issue and taught to everybody, went around, the whole Jewish community of Babylonia and said, in the name of Rava, the statements that I said to you are a mistake on my part. But this is what they said in the name of Rabbi Yanai. If the two sons were initially recognized, right, one of them was known to be the firstborn, and then the babies were mixed up, then each can write an authorization to the other. But if they never knew who was the firstborn, if there was not one initially recognized as a firstborn, then they may not write an authorization for each other, right? He not only admitted that he was wrong, but he made sure that the entire community knew that he was wrong, lest somebody rely on his erroneous ruling and violate halacha. New subject. The residents of Akra de Agma sent the following inquiry to Shmuel. Teach us, our master, if the court had a presumption concerning this son that he is a firstborn, and his father says concerning another son of his, he is the firstborn, then what is the law? So the court had reason to believe, like it was just kind of known and accepted in this town, who was the firstborn in this family, and they were gonna confer on him something. Maybe after the father dies, it's about the inheritance. But the father, before he died, said, well, no, all you people are mistaken. You think that that's my firstborn son, but he's not. I actually know that this is my firstborn son. Again, probably multiple wives in the situation. But the father says about his own sons, the guy you think is my firstborn, you're all wrong. This is my firstborn. So the question is, now that the court had already established a presumption of who the firstborn was, do we believe the father when he says, no, that's not my firstborn. This is my firstborn. Shmuel sent to them in response, both of these sons write an authorization, each to the other. In other words, it's going to be one of these two. The court had assumed one, the father named the other. That's creating, so there was initially some kind of acceptance that this is a firstborn, so qualifies for the law we just stated a moment ago in the name of Rabbi Yanai. But the father now changing who the firstborn is in the eyes of the court has created a doubt, and therefore we don't fully accept the father's testimony, but it's enough to create a doubt, and so these two sons will split the portion of the firstborn. Now we're on page 127b. The Gemara questions this ruling. Whichever way you look at it, Shmuel's opinion is difficult. If he holds in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis with regard to this issue, he should have sent them a response in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. And if he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, he should have sent them a response in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And Shmuel's response is not in accordance with either of those opinions. Now, we are surely wondering, what did the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda argue about? What are these positions? The Gemara answers, Shmuel is uncertain whether the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda or in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. Therefore, he sent them a response that incorporates both opinions. We're going to split the double portion the extra portion of the firstborn among, the son who the court thought to be the firstborn and the son who the father said, no, he's my firstborn. But this doesn't concord either with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion or the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. And we still don't know what it is that Rabbi Yehuda said and that the rabbis disagreed. So are we going to find out now? Yes, we are. The Gemara explains, what is the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis? As it is taught in a Baraisa, expounding the verse, quote, he shall acknowledge the firstborn from Deuteronomy 21:17, the sages said, he, the father, shall acknowledge him to others. Right? So what does it mean that the father shall acknowledge him? He shall make it known who is the firstborn. In other words, a father is deemed credible to tell others that this is his firstborn. And from here, Rabbi Yehuda says that a man is deemed credible to say, this is my firstborn son, even if he has sons presumed to be older. Doesn't matter what the townspeople think. Doesn't matter what the court thinks. If the father says, this is my firstborn son, we listen to the father, says Rabbi Yehuda. And just as a man is deemed credible to say, this is my firstborn son, so too a man who is a priest is deemed credible to say about his son, this is a son of a divorced woman, or this is a son of a Yavama who has performed chalitza. In both of those cases, his son would be disqualified from serving as a priest due to his flawed lineage, right? A priest is not allowed to marry a divorced woman. If he does, his son is a Cohen, but is disqualified from serving as a Cohen. He's a disqualified priest because his father married a divorced woman. And a Yavama, right, a woman whose husband died childless, and then she had the opportunity to marry his brother, and she and the brother opted not to marry each other, so they perform chalitza. That's considered like a divorce, just in the realm of priests, right? Because, she was once, had an obligation to that. She was married to a priest, she was married to a man, and then he died, right? So she, as a widow, a priest could marry her. A Kohen Gadol can't, but a regular priest could marry a widow. But because she had that obligation to the brother, and they opted not to marry each other, and they perform chalitza, that's like divorce for the purposes of if she later marries a Kohen, the Kohen's son will be disqualified from serving in the temple as if the priest had married a divorced woman. Okay, so the point is that a father is deemed credible to say, yeah, I didn't really tell anyone at the time that this woman I brought home, from my journey up north, and I married her and we raised a family. I didn't tell anyone, but the truth is she was a divorced woman, or she was a chalutza, and therefore his son is disqualified from serving in the temple or from duchening, from making the Kohanic blessing over the congregation. Where are we here? So the point is that we believe the father, right? This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. We believe the father to say that so-and-so is my firstborn son. We believe the father to say that he's the son of a divorced woman. We believe the father to say that his son is the son of a chalutza. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, right, the majority who overrule Rabbi Yehuda, is that we don't find the father credible to make these statements. We don't believe the father. Very interesting, right? So we don't believe the father to establish one of his sons as the firstborn when there was already a presumption that this guy wasn't the firstborn. We're going to need more than just the father's testimony. And we don't believe a father to take a son that was accepted as a qualified priest to serve in the temple and render him disqualified. Quite interesting. Why is that? Let's keep reading. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said to Rava, granted, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this is the reason that it is written, he shall acknowledge. Rabbi Yehuda derives from these words that a father is deemed credible to attest to the identity of his sons. But according to the rabbis, the majority who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, why do I need the term he shall acknowledge that's written in the Torah about the firstborn, about the father's identification of the firstborn? And the Gemara answers, well, that phrase is necessary for a case when the son requires identification, i.e., when there is no presumption as to the identity of the firstborn. If we don't know, if the townspeople, the villagers, the court of that town have no opinion, they don't know who the firstborn is, there is no presumption, and the father comes and says, this is my firstborn, or this is the son of a divorced woman, okay, then we accept the father's testimony. Now recall, that's testimony of an individual. Normally we only establish a matter by the testimony of two witnesses. Here we're establishing it by the testimony of one witness. Very strong witness, the boy's father. But that's going to be only in the absence of a previous presumption. Now the Gemara asks, according to the rabbis, with regard to what law is it necessary for the verse to teach that a father's identification of his firstborn is deemed credible? If it is with regard to giving him a double portion, it is superfluous. Let the son be only like another person, i.e., one who is not an heir. If the father wants to give him a double portion of his estate as a gift, as opposed to a bequest, as a gift, the father can do that. Can he not give it to him? Since the father can give a double portion to the firstborn without having to testify that that boy is his firstborn, it cannot be that the verse is teaching us that he is deemed credible with regard to the law that a firstborn receives a double portion. And the Gemara answers, no. It is necessary with regard to property that came into the father's possession afterward, after he testified that his son is his firstborn. He could not have given him this property as a gift, as at the time of his testimony, the property did not yet belong to him, and one cannot transfer ownership of an item that one does not yet own. Therefore, it is necessary for the verse to teach that the father's testimony is deemed credible, so that the son can receive a double portion of the father's future property as well. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Meir, who says that a person can transfer an entity that has not yet come into the world, which would mean that one can give away his property even before it enters his possession, why do I need the term, he shall acknowledge? And the Gemara answers, the term is necessary for a case where property came into the father's possession when he was moribund, right, on his deathbed, at which point he cannot transfer ownership of any of his property to others. And it is with regard to such property. Now, wait a minute. Didn't we say that actually we relax the stringencies about bequeathing and gifting to somebody on his deathbed? Here they're talking about a person who on his deathbed is so moribund that he's not able to speak. That's the case that they're talking about. It is with regard to such property that the verse states, he shall acknowledge, to teach that the son who the father states is the firstborn will receive a double portion even of that property. I'm close to done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The sage is taught in a baraisa, if the court had a presumption concerning a son that he is a firstborn, and his father comes along and says concerning a different son that he is the firstborn, the father's statement is deemed credible. Right, so that seems to comport with Rabbi Yehuda. If the court had a presumption concerning a son that he is not a firstborn, and his father said that he is a firstborn, the father's statement is not deemed credible. Oh, now that's a new nuance, right? It's we're going to believe the father about his sons in some cases, but not in others. So what's the difference? So if the court had already said, okay, this guy's the firstborn, and the father comes along and says, that guy's the firstborn, then we accept what the father says. But if the court had a presumption about this one son, well, we don't know what else is going on in the family, but about this one son, we know he's not a firstborn, and the father comes along and says, no, that son is the firstborn, then we don't believe the father. Why? And the Gemara asserts that as the two laws of the Baraisa seem to contradict each other, it must be that the first clause represents the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that we accept the father's testimony, and the latter clause represents the opinion of the rabbis, that we don't accept the father's, individual testimony, one witness testimony as opposed to two witnesses, because it's really going to harm, his son, and we're going to require more than what might be some kind of emotional outburst of the father, and that's why the rabbis rule that way. Rabbi Yochanan says that if one says about another, he is my son, and then he says, he is my slave, so his latter statement is not deemed credible. It cannot disqualify him from marrying a Jewish woman or exclude him from his inheritance, right? The father said, he's my son. Okay, now everyone says, that's the guy's son. So the townspeople, right, the community views that man's son as his son. If the father later says, actually, he's not my son, he's my slave. Now, the change in status for that young man would be enormous, right? Instead of inheriting his father's estate and just being a Jew who can marry, any Jewish woman, if he's now understood to be a slave, so he can't inherit from his father, he can't marry Jewish women while he's still a slave, etc. Huge problem for the young man. So to lower his status that much, we don't accept the testimony of the father. Conversely, if the father says, he is my slave, and the community gets to know this young man as the man's slave, right? Slavery, thank God, hasn't been permitted in a long, long time, but when it was, the community accepts this young man as the slave. And then the father says, actually, he's my son. So then the latter statement is deemed credible, as in his first statement, he presumably was saying, he serves me as a slave does. That's what we're going to interpret it as. So in other words, because the young man, his status is elevated, I don't know if that's the policy reason for the difference. It hasn't said what the reason for the difference is, but the outcome is that the father first says, he's my son, and then later the father says, he's my slave, we don't believe the father's second statement. But if the father first says, he's my slave, and then later the father says, actually he's my son, we do believe the father's second statement. So an important difference. And the opposite law applies to one who is at the tax house, right? The tax house. Ancient world, they didn't have, this very systematized, corruption-free taxation system. But remember, there were paid tax collectors, very unsavory characters, where corruption was rampant. And people, who were honest people, were still trying to avoid being stiffed by corrupt tax collectors. So what could happen? If the father is passing by the customs house and he says about a certain person, he is my son, and then later he says, he is my slave, so his latter statement is deemed credible, as presumably he made the first statement that the slave is actually his son. Why? To evade paying the head tax on a slave, right? There was some kind of annual tax, like property tax, that they paid on slaves. And he was just trying to avoid paying that tax, right? Let's say a corrupt tax. And that's why, we're going to allow this statement to hold water. Conversely, if this father says at the customs house, he is my slave, and then later he says he is my son, then the latter statement is not deemed credible, as one would not unnecessarily render himself liable to pay a tax by saying at the customs house, he is my slave, if in fact the young man is his son, because now he has to pay this head tax, which he wouldn't have had to pay if he had simply said, this is my son at the outset. Now, this is in the absence of proper further evidence, right? It's when we only have this very limited evidence. This is how the Gemara is instructing the court to interpret it. The Gemara raised an objection from Brisa. If one was serving another person like a son serves his father, and the person being served came and said, he is my son, and then he said, he is my slave, well, his latter statement is not deemed credible, right? Because they seem to be carrying on with the relationship of a father and son, and then later the guy says, he's my slave. Well, we don't know why he said that, but everyone created a presumption that this was father and son. Additionally, if one was serving another person like a slave serves his master, and the one being served came and said, he is my slave, right? They were acting like a master and slave, and the master said, this is my slave. And then later he said, he is my son. The latter statement is not deemed credible. And this contradicts Rabbi Yochanan's statement that if he first says that he is his slave and then says that he is his son, his latter statement is deemed credible. And finally, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, there in Rabbi Yochanan's statement, it is the case where he is presumed to be a slave because everyone calls him a slave. Because everyone calls him, quote, a slave on whose border are 100. Enigmatic phrase. Since everyone is referring to him in this manner, the person he served cannot call into question his status as a slave by saying that he is his son. And the Gemara asks, what does it mean, this phrase, on his border are 100? And the Gemara answers, 100 dinars are adjacent to this slave. In other words, he is worth 100 dinars. What they're just saying is everyone understood that this was a slave. Now, if the father later is saying, no, he's my son, it's probably because the father is, trying to, maybe he has a son that he can't stand, and he's trying to elevate the slave to the status of son so that he can, give his fortune to the former slave rather than to give it to his, undeserving son. And he could do that as a gift, but he's not going to be able to, change the status of slave to son without going through the process of, freeing the slave and adopting him as his son. He can't just call him his son and make it so. And that concludes our learning for today. So let me take some questions. Nina is not available to run me the questions. So let me scan the comments here. Joe, if a firstborn, for whatever reason, is not given a double portion, is he still expected to lead the household as the oldest son? I've read that the firstborn was to become the leader of the family or clan, and the double portion was to help out within the extended family. What an interesting, interpretation or factoid. I don't recall hearing that. Makes a lot of sense. So I don't know if that somebody was saying, well, this, seems to me like an explanation. Or are you saying that it says that elsewhere in the Gemara? I just don't, it's not on the tip of my mind, as it were. But it certainly makes some sense. Who are you going to invest as the leader? On the other hand, you had, Jacob and Esau, right? Esau was born first. They needed the leadership of the clan, right? And the mission to become a patriarch of the Jewish people, to invest in Jacob. So they gave him that blessing. Not because he was the firstborn, but because he was the more deserving. Whereas if Asaph had been fit for that role, then he would have been both the leader and received that double portion. So it's very interesting that I love this idea that the reason the Torah gives a double portion to the firstborn is because he's going to have these added responsibilities as the leader of the clan. I just don't know, what the source for that is, but it sounds good to me. And Sharon says, I thought the original concern about a bris, a circumcision on Shabbos, was the concern of the moil carrying or preparing and sharpening tools. But Shabbos prohibition was lifted for that reason, but blood spilling is also very reasonable. But you can't spill blood on Shabbos, right? Then they're going to say, well, we're going to override that, and we are going to perform the bris because it's a positive commandment that's in the Torah. We don't do it. For example, if the child, was jaundiced, and so we weren't going to be able to make the bris on the 8th day. Let's say he is going to be healthy enough for the bris on the 10th day, and the 10th day is Shabbos. Now, we don't override Shabbos because it's not an 8th day bris. Then we would wait for Sunday. There is that concern. It's sort of like that was one of the sides in the debate. But for the purposes here, the principle is we do override Shabbos. But we don't sharpen the knife. Like if there's no sharp knife, the question is, do we sharpen the knife on Shabbos so that we can perform the bris on Shabbos? That should have been done before Shabbos. It wasn't. So maybe now we're not able to, we're not going to extend the heter, the permission to violate Shabbos for a bris, to also, create or sharpen the implements for that bris. But what was relevant today was that if we're unsure of the obligation because the child was born as a tumtum, we're also not going to override Shabbos. And that's all the questions I've got. So, with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. After Shabbos ends here in LA, it's getting earlier. I think Shabbos ends for us like 6:45. So by the time I get on the air, probably like 7:45 here in LA, and then tomorrow night the clocks change. So after that, it's going to be much more. It's going to be quite a bit earlier on Saturday nights, which will be nice for everybody. That's what I've got. So a good Hodesh Tov, happy Rosh Hodesh, and a good Erev Shabbos. And may everybody have a sweet, uplifting, rejuvenating, inspiring Shabbos. Good Shabbos.